Berlin, 1632. Introduction. The streets of Berlin were a graveyard of the past, shattered glass, burnt-out shells of buildings, and a sky that seemed to mourn for the city's lost youth. The sound of distant artillery echoed through the ruins, the steady growl of approaching storms. It was the final act of a war that had lasted too long, and the characters who wandered these desolate streets each carried a story that led them to this moment, a moment that would change them, whether they survived or not. First character, the Soviet tankist. Private Mikhail Ivanov gripped the cold metal of his tank's turret as it rumbled over the rubble-strewn streets. The roar of the engine was muffled by the thick fog of war that had settled over Berlin. His comrades were silent, silent like the ghosts that walked these streets. It was as if the city itself had given up, resigning itself to the inevitable. Mikhail had been in the war for too long, seen too much. The people who had cheered when the Soviets first arrived were now a distant memory, replaced by sullen faces that watched them pass with empty eyes. It was a strange thing, to be a liberator and a destroyer all in one. "How much further?" Mikhail asked, his voice gruff. "Not much," replied the commander, his tone just as flat. The city was already half ruined. "We'll be at the Reichstag soon." The Reichstag. The heart of the Third Reich. The place where it would all end. Mikhail had heard rumors. The Führer was gone, but the war? The war still had one last, bitter fight to deliver. The officers had been briefing them about the German army's last stand, but Mikhail didn't believe in such things. He knew how this would end, he had seen enough of it to know. The streets were quiet now, eerily so. In the distance, a small group of German soldiers, perhaps a dozen, were retreating, no longer a real fighting force, but a ragtag group trying to escape the inevitable. They were moving quickly, slipping through the ruins of a once thriving city, trying to outrun the advancing Soviet forces. Mikhail could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the old grudges of war that would never be settled, only buried in the rubble of what was left. Second character, the American scout. Corporal James Westbrook crouched behind the shattered remains of a brick wall, his rifle clutched tight in his hands. He had been trained for this moment, for this city, yet nothing could prepare him for the reality of it. Berlin was unlike anything he had imagined. It wasn't the epic battleground of Hollywood movies, it was chaos, a city torn apart by the very men who had once believed they were invincible. He shifted carefully, peeking around the corner. His eyes narrowed. His orders had been simple: get to the rendezvous point near the Reichstag, gather intel, and prepare for the final assault. The Germans had crumbled, he had seen that with his own eyes. But there was something about Berlin's silence, the way the city had fallen into an uneasy stillness, that made him uneasy. It was as though the city itself was waiting for something. Westbrook adjusted his radio, checking in with his squad leader, but the response was static. The communication lines had been spotty all day. They had been creeping through the city block by block, trying to avoid German patrols and any remaining soldiers. He pulled the map from his jacket and unfolded it, studying the streets. The Reichstag was only a few blocks away now, but it felt like miles. The only thing that mattered was getting the intel back to HQ. Westbrook to command, he muttered into his radio again. Silence. The city was alive with the sound of gunfire in the distance. Could be the Russians, he said quietly to himself. His nerves were frayed. He had been on the ground in Normandy, through the hills of France, and had seen combat in Belgium, but this was different. It was as if every moment here was a countdown to an inevitable clash. He needed to move quickly. He could hear footsteps, a few German soldiers on patrol. They weren't far away. Third character, the German civilian. Hannah Weiss clutched her mother's scarf around her neck, the fabric damp with the cold of the evening. Her family's apartment in Berlin had been torn apart by artillery strikes, and now she was homeless, wandering the city with nothing but the remnants of her life. Her once beautiful neighborhood, filled with the vibrant hum of pre-war Berlin, was now a decaying husk. Her father had died months ago, a casualty of a bombing raid. Her mother had died earlier that year, caught in the crossfire between retreating German soldiers and the Soviet advance. There was nothing left for her here, nothing but memories and the distant, terrible sound of war. The city was deserted now, save for the occasional soldier passing by, some of them in rags, others wearing uniforms that no longer had meaning. She had tried to stay away from them, had even managed to avoid the draft early on. But now, as the final days approached, there was nothing left but survival. Hannah had heard rumors. The Allies were close, the Soviets even closer. It seemed inevitable now that Berlin would fall. But there was one thing she didn't know: where to go. The city was a labyrinth of broken glass and twisted steel. Every corner she turned felt like a trap. The only thing that kept her moving was the strange hope that, perhaps, the war would end soon, and she could find a way to rebuild her life. Fourth character, the deserter. Sergeant Carl Weber moved quickly through the alleys, his uniform torn and bloodstained. He had been a soldier for the Reich, but now, after months of fighting, months of losing comrades and friends, he was done. He couldn't take it anymore. The war had consumed him, consumed all of them. He had joined the Wehrmacht as a young man, eager to serve his country. But what had he learned in these years of madness? That the very people who had called him a hero were the same ones who had abandoned him when it mattered most. He had deserted his post near the Brandenburg Gate, his rifle discarded in the dirt. They were retreating now, his comrades scattered in disarray, desperate to escape a fate they could not avoid. Karl had seen enough. He couldn't go on fighting for a lost cause. Now, he was just a shadow, a man caught between two worlds, neither of which wanted him anymore. The streets of Berlin had no mercy for him. He moved silently, staying in the shadows, avoiding the soldiers who might still be looking for deserters. His heart raced as he passed an abandoned building and caught sight of a Soviet tank rumbling down the street. The tanks were getting closer, and the Allies wouldn't be far behind. Karl knew this would be his last chance to escape the war. As the clock ticked towards 1730, the threads of their lives began to converge. For souls, each walking their own path, unaware of the others yet bound by fate. The streets of Berlin were a maze, and in the next hour, they would find themselves at the crossroads of their lives, at the threshold of a war that would reshape the world. The final act was about to begin. First character, the Soviet tankist. The tank's engine roared louder as Mikhail's crew accelerated toward the heart of Berlin. The streets that had once been filled with life now lay in ruin, and the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire and the occasional explosion. The city had become a graveyard, a place of memory and sorrow, but also of opportunity. For Mikhail, the mission was clear: crush the last remnants of resistance, secure Berlin, and finally bring an end to the war. But as the tank rumbled forward, a strange unease settled over him. The reports from the front lines were conflicting. Some said the Germans were completely defeated, while others spoke of fanatical holdouts. And there was the persistent rumor that the Führer was still alive, holed up in his bunker, directing a final desperate stand. Mikhail didn't buy it. He had seen too much death and destruction to believe in such fantasies. "Keep it tight, Ivanov," his commander barked. Mikhail's hands tightened around the turret controls as he scanned the streets ahead. There was something off about the atmosphere today. It was as if the city itself were holding its breath. Ahead, a column of German soldiers, men too young, too old, or too broken to fight, were marching in disarray. Mikhail saw them, their faces drawn, their weapons useless. He had seen these men before, broken remnants of a once proud army, retreating in defeat. "Command, this is Ivanov. We've spotted stragglers on the street ahead," Mikhail radioed in. "Permission to engage?" The response was immediate. "Negative, Ivanov. Keep pushing forward. The Reichstag is your priority." Mikhail's jaw clenched. He could see them clearly now, the German soldiers. They had no will to fight, no hope left. He could kill them all, and it would mean nothing. It would not bring peace, it would only add to the madness. But he knew his orders. His duty was not to question. He gave the command, and the tank moved forward. Second character, the American scout. Westbrook crouched low, moving swiftly from shadow to shadow. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath was shallow as he listened for any sounds that might give away his position. The city was too quiet. It was as though Berlin had become a mausoleum, the only sounds the wind carrying the remnants of a broken empire. He had made it past the first few blocks, but the rendezvous point was still too far ahead. The narrow alleyways felt endless, and every corner could be a German patrol. He had to be careful. "Stay focused," he muttered to himself. Suddenly, the sharp crack of gunfire pierced the air, followed by a distant rumble. Westbrook froze, instinctively reaching for his rifle. His fingers tightened on the grip. The shot had come from the direction of the Reichstag. Whoever had fired it was no longer interested in silence. They were engaged. "Damn it," Westbrook cursed under his breath. He had no intention of getting caught in a firefight now, not with the objective so close. He had to reach the German resistance group his superiors had briefed him about. They had to know how the Soviets were positioning themselves and how the Germans were planning their final stand. But in a city this chaotic, anything could happen. Trusting his instincts, he moved toward the source of the fire. Third character, the German civilian. Hannah had always believed that Berlin was her home. She had spent years walking its streets, watching the city's seasons change, listening to the sounds of its busy streets, filled with laughter and life. But now, as she moved cautiously through the city's ruins, her world had collapsed into dust and echoes. The sound of marching boots made her freeze. She had seen soldiers before, too many soldiers, but today, the sight of them stirred something deep inside her. Her hands trembled as she hid behind a collapsed building, watching as a few German soldiers, disheveled and broken, passed by. Their eyes were vacant, their movements sluggish. Some looked like they didn't even know where they were going anymore. Hannah shifted to the other side of the ruined building. She needed to find food. She needed to find safety. She didn't care if it was in the Soviet-controlled zone, the American sector, or wherever. Anything was better than the streets of Berlin, filled with soldiers, destroyed buildings, and the constant threat of death. But as she rounded a corner, she stopped short. There, in the middle of the street, was a young German soldier. His face was pale, his uniform tattered. He had abandoned his comrades. And just like Hannah, he seemed to have no place left in this war-torn world. "Please, help me," the soldier whispered as their eyes met. His voice was barely a breath, a fragment of humanity in a city that had forgotten kindness. Without a word, Hannah nodded and motioned for him to follow her. She didn't know why she was helping him. Perhaps it was the desperation in his eyes. Or perhaps it was the simple, human need to connect with someone before everything collapsed entirely. As she led the soldier deeper into the ruins, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the sound of distant tanks, or maybe just the weight of the situation pressing down on her. But something was coming, something bigger than she could comprehend. Fourth character, the deserter. Carl had never been more terrified in his life. The sound of distant tanks growing louder was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. He had once believed in the cause. He had fought for the fatherland, for the Rye, but those days were long gone. All that remained now were the ruins of his pride. He was a deserter, no longer a soldier, just another man trying to survive. The street ahead was empty. He could hear the rumble of Soviet tanks in the distance, their steel giants growing closer with every passing second. His stomach twisted. He had no intention of facing them. But where could he go? The Allies were closing in from one side, the Soviets from the other. The city itself was a trap, and he was caught in its snare. Carl moved swiftly, staying to the shadows. He had to reach the canal. The resistance had told him that a small group of German soldiers were trying to escape through the city's waterways. Maybe, just maybe, he could make it out alive. He had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to hesitate. As the final hour approached, the tension in Berlin grew unbearable. The Soviet tanks were closer now. The American scout was moving into the heart of the city. The civilian was trying to survive amid the destruction. And the deserter? He was running out of time. In the next few minutes, their paths would cross, unaware of each other, yet bound by fate. All roads led to the same place, the same moment. The hour before the final clash. The clock was ticking. First character, the Soviet tankist. The roar of the Soviet tanks grew louder. Mikhail's stomach tightened as he observed the city around him. Berlin, a city once filled with vibrancy, was now nothing but rubble. The structures that had once stood as symbols of power were now twisted skeletons, ravaged by bombings and artillery fire. The streets, now littered with debris and the remnants of lives that had once been full of hope, were eerily quiet. He glanced at the commander, his eyes betraying the exhaustion that had been building up for weeks. "We're almost there," the commander said flatly, but Mikhail could see the weariness in his face. It wasn't just physical, there was something deeper, something that spoke to the soul of a soldier who had been too long at war. Mikhail's fingers tapped nervously on the edge of the turret. "The Germans must know we're here by now," he said, his voice heavy with realization. His crew was tense, everyone knew that Berlin was teetering on the edge. It wouldn't be long before all hell broke loose. The tank rumbled on, passing by burnt-out cars and the broken bodies of fallen soldiers. Mikhail felt an odd sense of unease. He had seen the horrors of war before, he had lived through them, but this felt different. There was something looming, a final reckoning, and they were heading straight into it. "Commander," Mikhail spoke up again, his voice low. "Should we contact higher command about the civilian presence? There could be innocents around." The commander hesitated. "We've got orders. Push forward. The Reichstag is the priority. We'll deal with the rest later." Mikhail didn't respond. He knew better than to question orders, but the thought of pushing forward, ignoring the human cost around him, made his skin crawl. As the tank barreled forward, Mikhail couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Suddenly, the street ahead of them erupted in gunfire, forcing Mikhail to slam the tank into reverse. The explosions rocked the ground beneath him, throwing up debris and dust. His eyes darted across the street, scanning for the source of the attack. Then he saw it, a lone German soldier, standing on top of a ruined building, firing down on them. It was a suicidal act. Mikhail's heart pounded. The soldier was hopeless, just like the others. He had nothing left to lose. "Get him!" Mikhail barked. The turret turned with a groan, and the tank's cannon fired. The German soldier was thrown backward, his body twisting in the air before crashing to the ground. Move forward, now! Mikhail ordered, his voice a mixture of disgust and determination. The battle had arrived, and there was no turning back. Second character, the American scout. Westbrook crept along the alley, the sounds of battle now deafening. The distant rumble of Soviet tanks, the occasional exchange of gunfire, and the shifting whispers of soldiers had all merged into an oppressive cacophony. Berlin was no longer a city, it was a war zone, and he was just one small part of the larger conflict unfolding. The radio in his hand crackled again, but this time, the voice that answered wasn't familiar. It was German. "This is the last warning," the voice said, cold and imperious. "You are surrounded. There is nowhere left to hide." Westbrook's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't supposed to be discovered. His orders had been clear: gather intel, avoid direct confrontation, and make it back alive. But there was no way out now. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he could feel the weight of his mission pressing heavily on him. As he sprinted down the alley toward the rendezvous point, the street seemed to close in around him. Everything was falling apart. The Soviets were moving in, and the Germans were trying desperately to hold on. The war had no place for survivors anymore, only for the endgame. The crack of rifle fire came from behind him, followed by the unmistakable thud of a bullet that struck a nearby wall. Westbrook instinctively ducked, but his mind was racing. His objective was simple: report back. But now, with the lines blurred and the clock ticking down, he wasn't sure if he'd make it out in one piece. He reached the corner of the street and froze, his eyes scanning for movement. Just ahead, a figure appeared, a young man, German, in civilian clothing. The man had his hands raised, as though surrendering. His eyes met Westbrook's, full of desperation. "Please," the German civilian whispered, stepping forward, his voice barely audible over the din of distant artillery. "Help me. I don't want to die here." Westbrook hesitated, his heart pounding. He wasn't a medic. He wasn't here to save anyone. His mission was to secure intelligence and return to base. But he couldn't ignore the plea. The man in front of him had no weapon. He was just another victim of this war, caught in the madness of a city on fire. For a moment, Westbrook considered his options. Then, with a sharp exhale, he motioned for the man to follow. They had to get out of the open. He didn't know where they were going, but survival came first now. Third character, the German civilian. Hannah could hear the tanks rumbling in the distance, their presence a reminder that Berlin was no longer her city. It was a battlefield, a place where only the strongest would survive. Her stomach churned as she led the soldier through the ruins, the streets now crawling with enemy forces, both Soviet and Allied. The soldier stumbled slightly as they turned a corner, but Hannah barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. She could hear the faint sound of gunfire and the explosion of distant shells. But something else was nagging at her, something she couldn't quite place. "Where are we going?" the soldier asked, his voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," she replied, though she had no idea where that might be. She had no place left in the city, no safe zone to retreat to. Berlin had become a trap, and it was closing in. Hannah's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden blare of sirens. They were coming closer. The Soviet tanks. The Americans. The enemy forces were closing in from all sides, and soon there would be no place left to run. But then, as they rounded a corner, something strange happened. The street ahead of them was empty. Silent. A lone figure stood in the middle of the road. A German soldier, his rifle slung loosely by his side. His uniform was torn, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked like someone who had given up, not just on the war, but on everything. For a moment, their eyes met. The soldier's expression was a mirror of her own: defeat, uncertainty, and perhaps even a glimmer of hope. Then, without a word, the soldier turned and walked away into the ruins. Fourth character, the deserter. Carl's heart raced as he finally reached the edge of the city, the sound of Soviet tanks growing louder in his ears. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His comrades had already fled, and the resistance had told him to follow the canal. But he wasn't sure if the canal would lead to freedom or death. He looked around the corner, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the approaching tanks. There was no escape now. This was the end of the road. There was nowhere left to go. And then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in front of him. A soldier, no, a civilian, emerged from the rubble, followed by another figure, a man who looked as if he had barely survived. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, Carl considered running, disappearing into the shadows. But he didn't. Not this time. Instead, he approached them, his hands raised in surrender. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. And in that moment, Carl realized that he wasn't alone. The war had taken everything from him, but in this last hour, there was one thing he could still offer: hope. The final hour had arrived. The tanks were close. The soldiers were closing in. And Berlin, the once proud heart of an empire, was on the verge of being consumed by the flames of war. The clash was inevitable. But in this last hour, in the midst of the madness, there were still moments of humanity, fleeting and fragile, like the city itself. First character, the Soviet tankist. Mikhail felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The streets of Berlin had become a labyrinth of fire and destruction, but they were no longer an unfamiliar battlefield. The final push had begun. Every turn, every corner, was laced with a deeper sense of urgency, a growing pressure in his chest. The Reichstag was within their grasp now, the symbol of the Nazi regime's last defiant stand. His commander barked orders, but Mikhail was no longer listening. His mind raced with images of the soldier they had killed earlier, the German soldier standing on the rooftop in a last-ditch effort to resist. In that moment, Mikhail had seen more than a soldier, he had seen a man, broken and desperate, fighting for a cause that no longer existed. Mikhail's hands gripped the turret controls, his thoughts clouded. He could feel the tremors of the tank's engine beneath him. The moment of reckoning was nearing, and he had no more illusions left. War had no honor, no justice. It was a machine that ground everything down to dust, leaving only scars in its wake. "Commander," Mikhail said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do you ever wonder if we're on the wrong side of history?" The commander didn't answer immediately. Mikhail didn't expect him to. In the end, it didn't matter. The orders came, and they followed them. That was the way of things. The tank thundered forward, its immense metal frame crushing the debris beneath it. Ahead, the Reichstag loomed in the distance, its once proud facade now a symbol of a dying empire. The Soviet flag would fly over it soon, but Mikhail knew it would bring no peace. It was just one more victory in a war that had taken everything. And then, in the street ahead, something caught his eye. Figures, men and women, appeared out of the shadows, stumbling over rubble, their faces gaunt, their eyes haunted. Some wore ragged civilian clothing, others still had the tattered remains of military uniforms. Mikhail's heart skipped. He could see the man from earlier, the one he had noticed through the scope. The German soldier. He was standing among the civilians, his rifle in hand, but his posture defeated. His eyes met Mikhail's, and for a fleeting second, time seemed to stop. Mikhail didn't order a shot. He just watched, unsure of what to do. The civilians scattered, hiding in the ruins, but the German soldier lingered. He didn't run. "Fire on them," his commander barked. But Mikhail shook his head. "No," he muttered. "We're not executing civilians." The commander glared at him but said nothing further. The moment passed, and the tank surged forward, crushing the remnants of the street beneath its weight. But Mikhail didn't feel like a victor. He didn't feel like anything. Second character, the American scout. Westbrook's heart raced as he crouched behind a crumbling wall, his eyes scanning the chaos before him. The street had erupted in gunfire moments before, and the world around him seemed to collapse into a blur of motion. The German soldier he had encountered earlier was nowhere in sight, and the civilian he had tried to protect had disappeared into the shadows. The rumble of the Soviet tanks grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. He knew the Soviets were closing in from one side, the Americans from the other. The final confrontation was imminent. The German resistance he had come to contact was either dead or scattered. There was no way to reach them now. His radio crackled, but the voice on the other end was faint, garbled by the interference. "Westbrook, report your position. We need to move, now." He cursed under his breath. The mission was a failure. There was no extraction point, no safe zone. There was only Berlin, broken, burning, and waiting to be consumed by the flames of war. As the tanks moved closer, the streets grew crowded with soldiers, civilians, and refugees all vying for the same uncertain fate. Westbrook's instincts told him to move, to get out of the open, but his legs felt frozen in place. He was a scout, trained to navigate these streets, to be invisible in the shadows. But now, with no one left to report to, no allies to trust, he wondered if he was just another cog in the machinery of a war that had already claimed too many lives. He took one last look at the chaos unfolding before him, the tanks, the soldiers, the civilians caught between it all, and then made his decision. He wasn't going to die in the streets of Berlin. He wouldn't be just another casualty of a war that had no place for him anymore. He moved toward the shadows, blending into the ruins, his footsteps silent as the world burned around him. Third character, the German civilian. Hannah had never felt more lost than she did in this moment. The war had stolen everything from her, her family, her home, her future. Now, as she stood among the ruins of Berlin, she wondered if there was any point in surviving anymore. The soldier who had followed her had disappeared into the smoke and rubble. She had tried to help him, tried to make sense of the madness, but it was too late. The war was over, and Berlin was a tomb. The question now wasn't how to survive. It was why. As the ground shook beneath her, Hannah's eyes drifted to the distant Reichstag. The Soviet tanks were closing in, the end of the war almost a certainty. There would be no victory here, only destruction. The Allies would take the city, and the Nazis would fall, but what was left for her? What was left for any of them? In the distance, she heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying. She turned toward the sound, her heart aching. She didn't know how to help, there was no safe place for anyone anymore. But she couldn't leave the child there. She couldn't walk away. Hannah rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the child, a young girl, no older than 5, crouched beneath a broken doorway, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The child looked up at her, fear in her eyes. "Please," the girl whispered. "I don't want to die." Hannah knelt down, her heart breaking. "You won't die," she said softly, brushing the hair out of the child's face. "Not if I can help it." But in her heart, she knew the truth. The war had taken everything, and it would take more before it was over. There were no winners in this city, only survivors. And if she could help even one person make it through the rubble, then perhaps that would be enough. Fourth character, the deserter. Karl's legs were heavy with fatigue as he moved through the narrow alleyways. The sound of the tanks grew louder, the ground shaking beneath his feet. His mind raced. He had been running for hours, trying to escape the inevitable. The war had destroyed him, and now it was coming to claim him once more. He stopped for a moment, his breath shallow, his thoughts unclear. He had no place to go, no one to turn to. The resistance had failed, the soldiers were all but gone, and Berlin itself was slipping through his fingers like sand. He heard voices, a group of civilians, huddled together in fear, trying to make sense of the chaos. He saw the woman, the one who had helped him earlier. Hannah. She was holding a child, comforting the young girl as best as she could. For a moment, Karl simply watched. He knew he should keep moving, keep running, but something held him back. He couldn't leave them. He couldn't abandon them, not after everything. With a heavy sigh, Karl walked toward them, his footsteps slow and deliberate. There was no going back. There was no escaping the war. But there was something in him now, something he hadn't felt in years, the faintest spark of redemption. As he approached, Hannah looked up, her expression wary but not hostile. She nodded at him, as if to acknowledge his presence. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to think he would be any different from the soldiers who had ravaged this city. But in that brief moment, they shared something, the knowledge that they were all in this together. And together, they might survive. The sound of the tanks was deafening now, but Karl didn't flinch. He had already made his peace. "Let's go," he said quietly. "We don't have much time." And with that they moved forward, as the final hours of Berlin unfolded behind them. The war was over. The city had fallen. And yet, in the midst of the destruction, something small, a glimmer of hope, of humanity, remained. For a fleeting moment, Berlin was not just a battleground. It was a place where lives intersected, where survival was not just about victory, but about reaching out to one another in the darkness. And in that darkness, there was still the faintest possibility of light.